All right, welcome and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Jane Irrigation Training Series. I'm your host, Richard Restuccia, and today we're going to be talking about greenhouse and nursery emission devices, and I can tell you why we are talking about that as I visit nurseries, as I visit greenhouses, and as I look in the catalog. One thing I certainly can see is that there are a lot of different ways to irrigate a pot. And I know that these different ways all have reasons and good ideas of why you would do them one way or another. But I think for somebody just in general looking at this or trying to figure out, oftentimes I might just go with what they've done in the past or what they've seen in the past. But there is a lot of variety in how you can do this. And so, I was talking to Michael Pippen about this, and Michael said, this would be a great webinar to do. And as you know, Michael Pippen, very, very good at providing these trainings. Michael, one thing that's very unique about Michael, I think a couple things is one, he grew up in agriculture. A lot of times we have people talking about things in a theoretical sense. Michael's lived the lifestyle. He knows what that's like. He's worked for distributors, dealers, and now manufacturer. He's our Director of Business Development at Jane and brings a ton of experience and knowledge to our webinars and more importantly to our customers. So Michael, welcome and thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Richard. And I think you're exactly right. You start looking at some of these product groupings and there is a little bit of decision fatigue, right? We're in that stage of technology where, if you're talking about entertainment or food or nursery, greenhouse, irrigation, there's a lot of stuff out there. And so, hopefully today we'll try to, unpack what are preferences, because preferences are important. But, beyond preferences, what are kind of the criteria or characteristics that I would say primarily drive those decisions. And then, then we can talk about preferences and ones that we just think do better for our specific application. So yeah, that's kind of where we're going to spend our time today.
Yeah, it's really interesting, right? As I go around to nursery, of course, I don't look at the plants first. I look at the irrigation, right? That's where my eye goes. And I'm always surprised at the variety of ways that people are doing this. But then again, I just look at our catalog and I see the variety of products we have to offer in this area. And I think, okay, this makes sense. And that's why I'm excited to go through this with you today. But before we do that, I just want to ask you one question. Do you see many nurseries or greenhouses that are hand watering, that aren't using automated irrigation or pressurized irrigation at all?
You do see it, but it's primarily in kind of a retrofit application that may not be performing the way that it was intentionally designed. So what I would mean by that is you might have an area that's not getting adequately water because you got a short contract and you've got these, these different size containers or there's different crop that the system really wasn't designed to. You're trying to get something, specific, kind of a one-off, if you will, of your typical applications. And there might be some hot spots where the water's not covering. It's generally not by design. I would say that there's very few that I see out there that are irrigating by design. You'll even see systems that, have both containers on the ground in the greenhouse and hanging from the structures. And even those would essentially have two irrigation systems to manage those separately and not have somebody in there hand watering. I think that there's a lot that goes into that hand watering. One is just you got to pay somebody to do that. And that's not, usually a good steward of your money, but also, trying to not just apply the right amount of water manually, but also in the same way, applying that if you decided, knowing you just need 1 gallon is one thing, but then to apply that 1 gallon evenly to more than 2 or 3 pots just wouldn't be feasible. So it's not really a practical way of doing it, but you will see a little bit of fill in that to hit problem areas. But I think most of that is because of a retrofit application for that wasn't quite designed for that originally.
Yeah, I think about that too. I'll count to 3, 1, 2, 3, and then go to the next pot. And I could just see myself after about 5 pots saying, did I water that last one or not? Or, which direction was I going? And I could see a lot of stuff's going to get double watered and some's not going to get it at all. And then the other thing that is so important for the nursery people and the greenhouse people, cost-wise, it's not cost prohibitive to do this.
Yeah, I mean, there's going to be material costs in any kind of irrigation system. So if you said, well, the option is to invest in an irrigation system or not irrigate at all, then obviously there's going to be a cost. There's a cost differential in there. But if you said, I'm going to try to irrigate it manually versus try to get a irrigation system, regardless of which one you say, I think that that definitely when you start trying to, talk about even water and plant and in a nursery application, you can't have half your crop blooming and the other half not, right? So maturity, stability is extremely important, even more so than a lot of our field applications. So yeah, it's just really not feasible in any kind of commercial scale to irrigate manually in any of the operations that I've been around.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, look, I'm really excited to get into your deck here.
Yeah, well, great. So I always say, you've got let's talk about the things that we prefer versus the things that really are driving the decision. And in a container or nursery greenhouse, I'm gonna kind of use these terms interchangeably. I think there's really probably two things that really drive the decision primarily. One is the size of the container that you're gonna have your plant in. And number two is kind of the soil or media characteristics. And I use those terms because we sometimes use soil. Sometimes we use a combination of different types of media, soil, gravel, perlite. I mean, I would say more often than not, we're using some sort of media mix rather than a pure soil. So quite different than what we're doing out in the field. And really, so what are those things, why do those two things drive the decisions? I think there's a couple of things. I would say that primarily in these plants that are in a container, most likely this is not their long-term or where they're going to spend their life, right? They're in this container for a period of time, and then they're going to be taken and either putting in a larger container or going and putting a permanent, even if it's a citrus tree that would go out in the field and agriculture says that's where it's going to be eventually. Or if you've got a ornamental that's going to go in your flower bed. So they have, this is not their final destination. So you've got a very limited time to grow a pretty developed and mature root structure. The container and the soil costs money, so we're always trying to use the smallest one possible. So it's very important that we get that soil, that media, that whole container watered evenly, side to side, top to bottom, as efficiently as we can. And so obviously if you have a large container, you're going to need to cover that surface area more evenly. That would not be a huge consideration in a tree that's planted in the ground. It's not as big a consideration because you have other environmental things impacting it, where that container is, that's it, right? The water you're putting there is essentially all it's getting, and under house, that is all it's getting. So you've got to be very precise on how you water that surface area. So the size of the container, in the media, we don't always have the opportunity to move that water laterally across the profile. And that's where you kind of get into that second step. If you're using a large container, but you have some soil media that's a little bit tighter, then that may be easier. But if you're having a gravel, that's going to definitely change the type of device you need to consider. And so really this container size and the soil media, those are things we're going to talk about and make our decisions based on, but we're really talking about, how big of a pattern we need to irrigate. If you want to think of it like in surface area, how much of that surface area do we need to irrigate? And how long will the water need to stay in this container? Is it going to fall straight through it and we're going to do this often, or is it going to hang out for a while? So that will help us describe the pattern we're looking for, and, kind of how much water and how fast we're going to put it out.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That's one thing I notice quite often is how fast these nursery containers drain. And it seems like that's the goal of the nursery growers, is to get the water in, but also not pool it. Is that correct?
That's right. So, I mean, you look at the container, and here's kind of just some, I think this is actually from a bamboo nursery. I kind of like their graphics, but it kind of showed, the size containers and the range that you're dealing with in a plant that gets really small all the way to very big, right? You can get little bamboo things that you sit in your windowsill, right? In these little bitty containers, or you can get them, they're literally like 50 foot tall. Now, I don't know why you'd want to buy necessarily a 25 foot tall bamboo in a 30-gallon container, but you could if you wanted to. So I like this graphic because it shows you the range that even one nursery might be operating in, right? And so same crop, different container, potentially could need a different emission device. You would not necessarily see this in the field, right? If you got a peach tree or a blueberry, it's going to kind of have the same thing its entire life, where you would not necessarily do that in the container. So I thought this kind of drove that point home to where you see this container size, how it can drastically affect how much of that surface area you really need to cover. And a lot of times when we're talking about kind of this media or this soil characteristics, they do not want the water to stay in there very much, right? We're essentially growing, if you want it, not hydroponically, but aeroponically, right? The structure in a lot of these, the soil structure in a lot of these containers, they're essentially just holding the plant up. And especially if you get in these indoor growing facilities, which is something that we talk about a lot and we're learning about, and we don't really know. We don't know what we don't know yet. We're still trying to figure out how to irrigate these large indoor growing facilities properly, whether it's vegetables or cannabis. I've seen some cannabis operations that basically where the plant was sitting in gravel. It had no nutritional value. It had no, really holding capacity. The water was doing everything. And so they would irrigate these cannabis plants, and the water held the nutrients just like a hydroponic. It drained right through. They captured it all and collected it back and ran it back through the cycle. And so that soil characteristic, to try to get a root structure developed properly when you're essentially growing in gravel is challenging, right? But it offers some advantages over a true hydroponic system. So there's some of these things that we're just now learning, where if you went to, maybe a more traditional container, like if you're growing a rootstock of a tree of some sort, you'd see something that had more similar to soil characteristics, like a pecan, or I don't do much work on the West Coast, but I'm assuming a lot of the nut crops are the same, where you have a tree that's growing fairly large, but the media or the container it's grown in is very similar structurally to what you do out in the field, because we're going to take that plant, drill a hole, and drop it in the field. We don't want to have a lot of characteristics differences between that type of container and other. So it's going to irrigate very similar to what you do out in the field. So again, a lot of variability there depending on the size of the container and the soil media that you're using.
So again, just establishing what type of soil media you have is going to help you click off your first step of what emission device to grab.
That's correct. And I've kind of used some generic terms here, because I think a lot of, again, you go to these nurseries and it's a little bit of a, it's like going into a restaurant and asking the cook for the recipe, right? You might get the general gist of what they're putting in there, but they might not tell you all the little secrets, right? Because that's their business, is the kind of their proprietary knowledge. And so you get this with some of these nurseries, and a lot of them, right? You're like, why do your trees look better? What kind of soil meter? Oh yeah, well, I'll put a little bit of this and a little bit of that, sprinkle this on top. They don't want to tell you everything, and I totally respect that. So, it's very hard to describe a soil media in a container like you would in the field, right? That we kind of have these terms established and these charts of the pies that have sand and silts, and like, you're not going to get that in a nursery. You're going to get his concoction that works great for his nursery at his size and his buyers. And so I've kind of used these very generic terms of a tight media or a loose media, which really on the tight side, I'd mean something that's more similar to like soil you would find out in the field. It's going to have some clay properties. It's going to have some silt properties. It's going to have some sand properties. It's going to react more like what something we planted in the ground would act like. A loose media would be kind of on the other end, like we described with that cannabis application, where they're basically growing aeroponically. The structure is holding the plant in place and helping that root system kind of spread out, but is really not providing very much nutritional value at all. It's just kind of there. Yeah. And then the large and the small container, obviously those are very, there's not established of what causes, it's called a large versus a small container, but I think you'll see, some of the examples try to, pull that out. There is no clear definition of where you change from a small to a large container, but I'll try to kind of tell you where my opinion is where that change is at. So these really are the decisions. So when you go back to your question about the media, a lot of times it is like, okay, go take a gallon of water and pour it through your media, and how fast does it drain out, right? When does that soil get dry again, and when does it need irrigating again? And your growers will be able to give you that information. And we have, equipment that can help do that as well. But, you can kind of weigh those things and be willing to get really precise. But a lot of it is take a gallon of water or whatever, a known amount, pour it in there, and let's see how long it takes it to drain out and what percentage of that does. Is a large percentage of small or you know, a small percentage of that water is drained through.
Yeah.
So I think the easiest one, we always want to start with the easiest, and I use that term loosely. I'd say probably the most forgiving maybe is a smaller container with a relatively tight or traditional soil type. A lot of things will work in that. It's kind of like planting a small plant out in, you know, in the soil in your, you know, landscape or in your agriculture setting. Small plant, you know, native soils, you can use a lot of different things. I kind of start here with the most simplest. You can see this diagram here where you've got these containers and they're stretching a poly tube across the top and most likely just punching a dripper right in on that container. That's a very effective way to irrigate a container nursery where you're not moving containers in and out a lot. I will pause briefly to say that some of these decisions will be driven by how long, some of your cultural practices, how long these plants are going to be in place, and, you know, what's kind of the rotation, and do you do different things? We're going to kind of stay away from that conversation because that is very site specific. If you have a question specific application, please ask it. We'll try to address it. But, you know, for this conversation, we're going to kind of say this is what we're doing for a pretty lengthy period of time. So you could put tubing, you could punch in a dripper, it could drip right down in that container. That'd be a super effective way of irrigating a container nursery that those containers didn't come in and out a whole lot. You don't have a lot of extra tubing, you don't have the stakes, it's kind of down and dirty, quick and fast. But a lot of times we are moving those containers in and out a lot, right? You like the drip, the water side is no problem, but you're looking for a little bit more efficient way of moving those containers in and out. And you'll see here in a small container, quote unquote small container, you've got the same dripper here. We'd put a piece of tubing on it and run it over there and stick that stake into that container. You're not changing really the way that that water is applied any, but you're giving yourself a little bit about flexibility about placement. Logistically, it works a little bit differently. I don't know that that's better or worse. There is more material out there, so that could probably cost a little bit more money, but you could keep the tubing on the ground, or you could hang it from a trellis, or you could do a variety of things there. You can really get that stake dialed in and placed just exactly where you want it to have the tubing move, you know, expanded and contracted down the row. It wouldn't move, the stake would stay in place. So there's some advantages to that. But, you know, again, a little bit costly side to put a specific dripper into one container. So some people will take a larger dripper, put a 4-way splitter on top of that, or a 2-way. We offer this in 2 ways or 4 ways, and we can run these stakes over, and we can put a stake in 2 containers. So instead of buying 4 emitters, you've bought 1 emitter, which is nice, right? That saves you a little bit of money. And so that's a very effective way. And where 4 is good, 8 is even better. We offer an Octa Bubbler. It comes up and it has 8 outlets on there that are equally pressure compensating. So very popular product, especially in indoor growing, where we want to be super precise, like that cannabis gravel example I gave. You know, you can get a little bit of variability in these stake outlets. We do our best there and have some things in place to keep the drips equal on these 4 outlets as much as we can. But this Octa Bubbler has an individual regulating device. So, you know, you can just look at it and say, well, this Octa Bubbler looks a little bit more expensive than that 4-way. Well, it is, but it's also giving you 8 outlets, twice as many outlets, giving you the exact amount of water out of each one of them. So it is, again, a little bit different application. And then we also just kind of have a trickle stake here, which is a little bit of everything.
We've got our first question coming in, and
okay.
it has to do with the 4-way dripper there, top left-hand corner. So if that's a 2 gallon per hour emitter, each one of those stakes is getting a half gallon.
Very close to that.
Yeah.
The stakes that we use in these 4-way assemblies is slightly different than what we'd use in a 1-way assembly. So on a 1-way assembly, you got 2 gallons an hour, water comes out of the tube and goes to this stake. And all that stake has is a little barb that holds it in place and the water drips down. It's not doing anything but kind of holding the tubing. And there's a couple of stakes that we offer in that, but that stake really isn't doing anything. This stake does something. It has a labyrinth that sticks up in that tubing that gives us a little bit of resistance. It is not necessarily what's regulating the flow. The dripper is doing that, but that little bit of labyrinth that gives it a little bit resistance balances out a little bit of elevation difference, a little bit of minor losses through all the snaking of the tubing, and does a pretty nice job of making it even. It will not always be even on every one of them. Water is a dynamic force, and just like if you had water going in one pipe and you put a T, does the equal amount go in each one of them? Very close, but not always exact. And that's how I describe this. I'd say for most applications, it's definitely close enough. But if you do not use that little labyrinth stake, you definitely can have some variability in your containers. So we use the labyrinth stake on the 2-way and 4-way outlets. On the single outlet, we just have a little barb one because it doesn't clog quite as bad. So
yeah, well, great. Thank you for clearing that up, and thanks for the great question. I want to remind everybody we do have the Q&A open. If you want to ask Michael any questions, drop them in there. I'll be sure he gets them. We have some comments. I've got the chat open as well. So okay, I interrupted when you were saying trickle stake.
No, that's great. I'd say kind of the other, I kind of skipped over the trickle stake. This little stake here doesn't even have an emitter, right? We just stick the tube in the main line, if you will, lateral line, and has just a spaghetti tube that runs up there, and the little trickle stake just holds it in place. So it's a very low cost application. Maybe some dirty water, maybe a plant that's super low margin. You're only going to grow it for a short period of time, in and out, but you need something to hold that tubing in place. So this does a pretty good job of doing that. So again, you would not necessarily want to do this on a large container, right? Because you can see some of the limitations in a product like this trickle stake, but you can use your imagination. So that's a relatively inexpensive product compared to the Octa Bubbler, with giving you the exact amount of water on 8 outlets. So you've got this huge range, exact amount of water, every container, 8 containers at one time, or little spaghetti tubing, inexpensive, not the greatest uniformity, but low cost, fast, very clog resistant. So a lot of products, a lot of applications there. The other quadrants, if you will, will move along a little quicker because you're going to see a lot of these products move to different regions or show up in different regions. And that's okay, right? A lot of these products can work in a lot of these different applications. Some would not necessarily work as well, but you'll again see in a small container, but a relatively loose media, you see these two products show back up. You're like, okay, well, what's the story with that? Well, again, if you have a very small container, let's say a 1-gallon pot, that's very small, that big around. One emission device is still probably okay for that, even in a loose media. If you had a slightly larger container, like a 3 or maybe even a 4 or 5, a 3 or 5 gallon, probably limiting it about 7 gallons, somewhere in there, that's medium size. A lot of people will put 2 stakes in that singular pot. They want the features of the drip, but they need to get a larger wetting pattern. Again, the extreme case would be the cannabis, right? Where they've got they're growing the plant, like maybe a hemp or something like that. The plant's larger, the container's bigger, but we're doing super precise chemigation and fertigation into that system. So they want the drip features, but they need a little better wetting pattern. So you can take these multiple outlets, put a couple of them in one container, still relatively efficient and effective price-wise compared to putting an individual drip on every, multiple drippers on one pot. You use the 4-way or the Octa Bubbler. So it's a great way to do a smaller container with a looser media. And then also you start seeing some of these small spray stakes show up, right? Spray sticks, spray stakes, they're the same thing depending on, we call ours spray sticks. So we use them both. But they would, something with a small pattern, doesn't throw water very far, but would work a little bit more effective with a looser media on a smaller container. You have to worry a little bit about overspray in this kind of application. You got a small little pot. It's hard to get all that water in these little sprays, but some of them have a down pattern. Some of them have a 90 degrees, some are 180. So there's some variability there, but you're going to need something that kind of sprays down like these Chafing spray sticks do at relatively low flow rates, right? You loose media, you're like, oh, well, I want the water pattern to be big, but you don't want to push a bunch of water. It's just going to fall through, especially if you have some sort of media that's providing some nutrition. Wouldn't be a great thing right there. So you can start seeing some of these spray sticks show up in these smaller containers with a looser media.
Yeah, it's interesting. I really like the idea too of putting two stakes in one pot, right? Otherwise, you know, maybe you're trying to snake something around the perimeter of your pot, and the labor on that's unreal. Not to mention when you have to switch it out, it's pretty difficult. So this definitely
That's
solves
right.
that problem.
If it was a permanent application, then not that big of a deal, right? You can do whatever, but these are not permanent, right? We're going to make these, we're going to take these, and we're going to do something else with them, right? The goal of the nursery is not to grow a tree in there forever. It's to grow it to where it's a marketable size and get it out of there and get something else in quickly. And so, yeah, the double stake, one assembly does work nice for that. And again, you're going to see basically the same product show up again. With these multi outlets can be very versatile in a large container. Same thing. So we got a tight media. So the media is going to disperse the water a little bit more evenly, a little bit easier. Evenly might not be the best word, but move laterally more easily. But we need the water. We need more water. We got a bigger plant. So putting one stake's not going to work. Take the Octa Bubbler, put two on there. Take this 4-way. Sometimes we'll even have different lengths on these 4-way assemblies, a short one and a long one. So you can do on each, you know, front and back of the pot, if you will. You don't have to get them all the same. And then you definitely would start seeing these spray stakes or spray sticks show up. Flow rate is higher, pattern is larger. You're going to sacrifice a little bit of uniformity in most applications because we typically don't use these in a pressure compensating application. So the pressure will vary a little bit on there, but they're not a really, really high flow rate. You know, we've got things that are 3, 5, and 7 gallons an hour. It's kind of some in-betweens there, a little bit different patterns. So you've got a lot of variability, a lot of options in this stick. But if you're looking at something that's just from a watering standpoint, let's say you're not doing a lot of fertigation. Let's say you're putting your nutrients in a slow release fertilizer in the soil media or something like that. That would be a common practice in a lot of nurseries. They put the soil media and some additives. Slow release fertilizers are really going to drive the majority of the nutrient program. So we're just water. So these sticks are relatively inexpensive. You could use one of them versus having to use 2 of the drippers, right? So there's some costing things there, and they'll cover a much larger area and surface area and provide a little bit more water. And so all those things can be really advantageous. You'll see these sticks a lot like with a large, you know, I see them like in the home developments, right? People build a new home and they don't want to wait 10 years for their oak tree, their red oak to grow, right? So they go buy an oak tree that's got, you know, a 6-inch caliper. Well, that's a big root ball. And you'll see sometimes having these sticks in those type of applications where they're going to put on some water. The tree is essentially sitting in soil, right? It's not really, I mean, there's a media mix, but they're going to pick that whole tree up, pick it up and drop it in front of your yard. So there's not going to be a lot of structural differences there. So it's going to hold water pretty well. It's going to capillary action work pretty well. Put a couple of these spray sticks in there, cover the whole thing. You can water it for a few minutes and be done with it. So that's a really, really good application for a large container with a relatively tight media.
So, Michael, we have another question coming in on this about these the spray pattern. Will it tell you this is the spray stick to use for a 5-gallon pot, or will it say, you know, the spray is 6 inches, 12 inches? How do they do that?
Yeah, I mean, it's most of the time the recommendation is made by the container size. That's relative to the container size in the nursery industry. There's a little bit of variability, but they're basically all the same. You know, you get same thing if you get a 72 count tray or 96 count tray. There will be some slight variations, but they're essentially the same. So when we know what a 3-gallon container essentially is the size of, you can get some variability, but essentially we know. So you will see a lot of these stakes sized that way because we know the dimension of the container. But ultimately, there's a flow rate and a pattern associated, you know, depth of the pattern, angle of that pattern, up, down. There are characteristics there that are defined. But yeah, you'll see a lot of the, you know, like the lower flow, like 3-gallon an hour pot spray stakes. You'll see them, you know, 3, 5, maybe a 7. When you start getting into that, you know, 5 to 7 to 10 gallon, you'll see people using like a 5, 7, maybe 12 or 13 gallon hour spray sticks, and they go up pretty high. So you get a pretty good range there. And of course, the higher the flow rate, higher the pressure, the little bit bigger pattern you get.
Right. And yeah, and I think too, right, I think about the diameter of the pots. They don't really get that much bigger. They get deeper, but they don't get wider.
Right. Yeah. Right. There's not, as far as dimensionally, there's not that much difference between a 3 and a 5-gallon pot. You know, from a 15 to a 30, that's a good bit difference. But you know, these small, especially these more common that we're looking at the smaller containers, 10 gallons and less, dimensionally, they're not that much different.
Right.
So kind of the last one here, we're showing the full range of colors and options here in our spray sticks. Because we've got a large container with a loose media, that means some of the higher flow rates are not going to cause us a problem with ponding and water washing all of our nutrients out, right? We might want this higher flow rate. So I'm showing a full range of spray sticks here. I'm also, again, showing the multi-outlet dripper. I think it really is probably the tool that would work in almost every application. I dropped off the Octa Bubbler here because when you see these large containers and loose media, you know, you're probably not going to use the Octa. It's probably not going to be inside of a greenhouse at this point. It's probably going to be out in the field in a nursery. And in that case, the Octa Bubblers are a great product to use, but also a little bit more expensive to get hit with a piece of equipment. You've got a little bit more rigidity to it. So you would not see the Octa Bubblers quite as much outside. If you had an indoor application, you know, that had a really large container you're moving stuff in and out of not too frequently, then the Octa Bubbler can make sense there. But I kind of drew the line and said, let's leave him and away from this large container, loose media. Let's look at some of these multi-outlets and the spray sticks there. I think that is probably the most common that you would see in this type of application would be like a spray stick to give you a higher flow rate and a larger wetting pattern, not so much worried about the water overspray because the container is going to be large enough to handle that. And so I kind of say that that's really, you see kind of the breadth of products there, a lot of it overlapping, a lot of it driven by the container size, but also kind of this media, you know, the drip will be a little bit more challenging in a loose media. You're most likely going to have to look at multiple drippers in one container unless you have a small container, and that's not a bad thing. It can be a very effective way of doing it, but you know, a 30-gallon container is going to be hard to irrigate with 1.5 gallon per hour dripper uniformly. On the other side of that, if you've got a smaller container and you're doing a pretty intensive fertigation program, it's going to be kind of hard to get the level of accuracy and efficiency that you're looking for out of a spray stick. So, and there's always the economic and the you know, and the marketability side of your nursery. You know, how fast are you moving these plants in and out? How long are you keep them there? Are you changing stuff? Are you growing mums all year long, or do you grow mums half the time and then you do poinsettias? So a lot of these decisions will drive, you know, kind of come into the preferences side is what I would say then. You know, which one we might be irrigating and fertigating perfectly adequately, but this four-way assembly just doesn't really work for my application that I'm having to move these containers in and out of all the time. Maybe a single outlet works really nicely because I have to move these containers in and out 4 times a year. So that's when you start getting into the preferences of what really functions well for your specific application.
All right, and with the four-way assembly, if you can put that back up one more time, I'm sorry. We're basically looking at you need supply tubing, you need your emitter, then you need your four-way assembly. Sometimes they come with tubing, sometimes without, right? And sometimes with a stake, and sometimes without. So you have to just be sure you cover all your bases.
That's right. But and I would say that maybe some dealers do it that way. Like if you're an end user, a nursery grower, and you go to your local irrigation distributor, he may do that, right? They may be you're selling drippers and four-ways and tubing and stakes. But I would also say you'd probably want to leverage our assembly capabilities at Jane, where you can order those however you want to, right? You can order them with the dripper and a four-way and the tubing length and the stakes already put on there for you, which is really nice. The tubing is not a terribly expensive piece of that entire assembly, so a lot of people will order it a little bit long. That way, if it gets dinged or cut or something like that, they can cut it back and put their stake back on, and you know they really haven't lost anything. You know that those labyrinth stakes are going to help balance out that water. So if the tubing is a little bit different length, it's not going to greatly affect your watering efficiency or effectiveness. So I would say order those things assembled unless you just don't know what size you're going to mess with, because that's a really effective way of getting all that done is just order 24, 36, 48, or a combination. You can do any combination that you want. We assemble those in Fresno.
Yeah, I love that you can order those assembled, right? I can get to growing right away instead of putting stuff together.
That's right. That's exactly right. It's just really a time consumption, but you can buy components, and it would be not uncommon to have, those as spare parts, but a new design system. Let's buy those assembled and save that time.
Yeah. So Michael, if people have additional questions for you, wanna pick your brain some more, how can they do that?
There's my email and my phone number. You can reach out to me directly. If I don't know the answer, we have here at Jane, we have a guy that spends a lot of time in the cannabis indoor growing market, kind of one of the primary jobs he has. So he has a lot of experience, has seen a lot of different things in a new and emerging market. It's kind of hard to keep up with. So I've got an extra set of eyes on that. We also have a greenhouse product manager that can help us get technical information, and he's spent a lot of time in the industry. So he's seen a lot of stuff. So we have some support staff well beyond me and what I've seen. So if you're outside the area that I've typically worked, kind of the central and eastern regions, don't worry, we've got people on staff that can help support us in whatever region or whatever crop you're growing as well.
Yeah, and you'll get them hooked up or directed in the right direction and make those introductions if you need to.
For sure. And also on our website has a lot of information in a greenhouse landscape tab that has a lot of our brochures, cannabis stuff, and Octa Bubbler cut sheets and dripper cut sheets and all that kind of stuff. So you can find a lot of it on the resource page.
Yeah. Well, wow, Michael, again, you did not disappoint. You always bring extra knowledge to these conversations. Sometimes we get the questions and I think, well, how much more can we learn about this? But I always learn something extra every time you're on. So thanks very much. I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge and experience with me and everybody else that's watching today. We really appreciate that.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, I look forward to anybody that wants to reach out and talk about the topic some more.
Yeah, and please, that's a generous offer. There's a lot of knowledge here with Michael, so please reach out and contact him for all your questions and really anything drip irrigation wise. Also, you can take a look at the rest of our trainings, over 200 now, at the janesusa.com website /trainings, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. I love that people are out working, listening to our podcast, educating themselves about water conservation and sustainability. It's just, it's inspiring to know that people are doing that. So anyway, thanks all of you who watched and participated. And Michael, thanks again for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Yes, sir. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, talk to you soon. We'll be back on Friday. We're going to be talking about climate change and what climate change is doing to your irrigation scheduling. So thanks again. We'll see you guys back here on Friday. Bye now.